Welcome to Farnborough and to Aviation Week's coverage. And we've got Tony Osborne, London Bureau Chief of Aviation Week and Defence Specialist. And Tony, we have a particularly unclear picture of what's going on with defence at the Farnborough Airshow this year. Why is that?
I think that's very true, Angus. I think what we've got going on here is we've got a confluence of several things. Farnborough is now sort of just one of 3 events that are happening at this time. We've just had the Global Air Chiefs Conference in London, Royal International Air Tattoo, and then finally we've got Farnborough. But we're also in this sort of mix of a higgledy-piggledy mess in the British government, where we've had the departure of Boris Johnson, a sort of a, although he hasn't quite left 10 Downing Street just yet, but obviously we're not sure if we're going to see many ministerial announcements around defence. So the sort of the picture here at the Farnborough Airshow is rather unclear about what ministerial announcements might come along, whether these be some sort of big announcements around sort of programmes. Some of those have already happened actually at the Royal International Air Tattoo. We saw a big £2 billion sort of announcement around the Typhoon radar programme. So what happens next, whether there'll be more announcements from the government around defence, it's really not that very clear about that on this show.
And of course we've got the other 2 factors that you haven't mentioned yet, which also fall into play, as this is the first post-COVID Farnborough.
Yep.
And we're seeing maybe an acceleration of some of the trends that we were seeing in the pre-COVID era of certain companies stepping back from their Farnborough presence. And also, of course, there's the not inconsiderable matter of the war in Ukraine that nobody was expecting, and that this industry is clearly very involved in.
Yeah, of course, I mean, we're obviously seeing the impacts of the war in Ukraine, not just on defence, but also the commercial side and sort of the plans for sustainability and aviation fuel. But I think you're entirely right that there's a mix of how to address the conflict in Ukraine. We've obviously seen some major changes in Europe in the last few months. Sort of the security outlook hasn't changed entirely, and so countries are now reconsidering their defence plans. They're obviously increasing their spending, but it's how to increase that spending, because no one ever expected the potential of a war with Russia. But that now has to figure back into the planning after many years of things like counterinsurgency and operations in Afghanistan. There's now this sort of state-on-state war that obviously we're considering would return, but perhaps not with the vengeance that it has that we've seen in Ukraine.
How easy is it, do you think, for some of these big defence companies to pivot in response to these geopolitical and transnational issues, and maybe reconfigure what it is that they want to talk about here?
I think it's an interesting question. We know that they're struggling to pivot, at least to prepare for the incoming resurgence of orders from nations, but I think it'll be the countries that decide how those companies will pivot, how they make their demands in terms of unmanned aerial systems, future fighters, and so on. I think that's how that pivot will be decided. We might see some evidence of that here at the show.